In this presentation, I'm going to provide some additional comparative insight into the themes discussed in your assigned readings related to political, cultural, and economic dimensions of global higher education. I really like tables 2.1 and 2.2 from Zhang's book about China. As you might recall, she referred to these rationales to explain China's historical and current motivations around internationalizing its higher education system. Your other readings offered some insight into political, economic, and sociocultural dimensions in various contexts, but in this presentation, I'm going to go a bit more into detail about these subcategories here on the right side of the table. And here's table 2.2. So keep in mind the various levels that internationalization activities and processes can impact. So individual participants and stakeholders, of course, but then also at the institution level, a university, a college, or a state system. You read, for example, about Education City in Qatar. And then at the national level, which is what Zhang's focus primarily was, and also the Lomer article about internationalization and soft power, right, in the UK. And then finally, we can think about internationalization at the regional level. And the EU is the best example of this globally, which we'll discuss more in this presentation. So there are a lot of reasons proposed for why countries and institutions and individual people should participate in higher education internationalization. But those are very intentionally described as rationales. So what's the actual evidence? Do these benefits actually exist? The more I've studied and worked in international higher ed, I've discovered there's a lack of high quality evidence about the outcomes of internationalization, particularly when we're trying to compare countries to one another and when we're trying to look at impacts over time, so longitudinally. That's why, actually, when designing your final assignment for this course, I intentionally included a component to explain how you can measure your initiative's success. And that's because we really do need more evidence about globally successful practices as well as failures. And even at the program or individual level, it's really important to think about how to demonstrate the impact of various internationalization practices. But more immediately, I'm going to share with you in this presentation some examples of different initiatives at the individual, national, regional, and institutional levels and discuss the extent to which evidence suggests that they actually achieved their intended political, economic, or sociocultural goals. Okay, let's start by looking at some of the evidence around political motivations for internationalization. And I'm going to situate this conversation at the regional level, especially within the context of the European Union and the Bologna process, which you read about in one of the assigned chapters for this module. So first of all, here's part of Zhang's table reproduced here just to remind you. And as you can see from this summary, most regional motivations are anchored in geopolitics. So it's actually a great sort of discussion in the context of the political rationale, as well as also to some extent around economic competitiveness. And two, I want to mention, which came out in the Lomer reading, there's also a national security aspect to regional political motivations in terms of modern geopolitics being, sort of in response to ideological opponents or, nations or regions that have fundamentally different values than what their opposing group does. All right, anyways, so how have regions used higher education to establish stronger relationships across their countries? So the EU actually here is the best example of region-level internationalization efforts, at least in higher education. So I do want to point out that at least comparatively, Asia, Africa, contemporary Latin America, the way that higher education cooperation works across countries there, it's more apparent at the sub-region level, not across their entire continents. So you can read more about this actually in the supplemental materials. I've included a chapter from a handbook entitled Regional Cooperation in Higher Education, which goes into more detail about a lot of these ideas that I'm summarizing here. Okay, so now taking it to the EU and Bologna. what's the evidence? There's agreement about, mostly among scholars and policymakers, that Bologna has led to this first regional level motivation, better alignment, although not perfect, of national higher education systems across Europe. That's especially in terms of these structures that Bologna put in place on paper. So first of all, where degree systems are concerned, most participating countries adopted the bachelor's, master's, doctoral framework. And that replaced more diverse and varying structures, but not without controversy in some countries. Like Germany, for example, their prior degrees were included a traditional diplome and magister, which were replaced. But switching from the diplome, their version called the diplome, to the bachelor's degree, there was a lot of resistance, especially in engineering and natural sciences, because that model and credential in Germany was very highly respected. But there's been more harmonization across degree levels. I'll reference in a second and some exceptions to that rule. But in addition to, again, on paper, there's the European Credit and Transfer Accumulation System. That became a common reference. So students are able, on paper at least, to more easily transfer across different countries within the EU. And then there's also a better understanding as to what a different degree represents if you earn it in, Germany, Belgium, Italy. There's more consistency and sort of recognition of what these degrees represent across the continent. And then finally, related to that, Bologna created this quality assurance, ENQA, organization, which establishes standards around overall quality. But as I've kind of already alluded to, a lot of scholars have found that there are many gaps on the ground in actually implementing these policies in specific countries. So for example, as I mentioned, Germany reluctantly transitioned to this 3-credit system, but in France, while they were quick to adopt, they call the bachelor's level credential license, but it's the same, license, master's, and doctorate. They were quick to adopt that structure when Bologna sort of was implemented in the early 2000s. But in the French context, their top elite institutions are called les grandes écoles, like the big schools, I guess, is the translation. Those institutions remained outside Bologna's mainstream, and they continue to offer selective and non-standardized programs. So it would be almost as if there was a dual system in the US where, let's say, our most elite institutions, the Ivy Leagues, let's say, have their own non-standard diplomas, and then everybody else awards standards, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees. So that's, something that's contrary to the idea of aligning national systems, but the French have chosen to go in that direction. In addition, so here's a great quote from Chu that kind of illustrates this. I'll also note that where student mobility is concerned, having more EU students attend or transfer between countries would probably also be a good indicator, right, of evidence for Bologna's success. But actually the data, and these studies here go into more depth about this, the data don't really back that up. There has not really been significant differences post-Bologna in student mobility between EU countries. However, though, again, on paper at least, and if we're coming back up here to our political motivations aligning national systems and potentially also sort of strengthening geopolitical alliances, certainly Bologna did lead to greater structural compatibility, which aligns with some of these political rationales. But so it's important to note that a lot of this harmonization is more procedural than actually substantive. And there are a lot of implementation challenges that sort of occur on the ground in various countries. And that's one of the challenges, again, this identity goal. Many of these countries in Europe have very strong national identities, and there's a lot of pushback against coming to a common EU identity. And that's not just in higher education, right? That's kind of in geopolitics more generally. But the Bologna process is the best example, I would say, of a regional internationalization strategy. And at this stage of the game, it's been, effective, but there's still sort of a lot of space for improvements when we're talking about true harmonization of systems across countries. At the national level, internationalization of higher ed is often justified from a political standpoint as well in terms of soft power and diplomacy. So here's again sort of the national level justifications from Zhang's table, and certainly there are a number of economic justifications, which we'll get to shortly, but from a political standpoint, diplomacy and soft power are central arguments that many countries make about why internationalization within the context of higher education is valuable. And these pictures here are actually, I experienced the legacy of the US commitment to higher education as a mechanism of soft power when I was in Ethiopia for the first time. And this is me visiting Addis Ababa University, and it was amazing because the very first thing that my colleagues did when they gave me a tour was take me to the campus library, which is the John F. Kennedy Memorial Library, which was established in the 1960s, and you can see on this cornerstone, sort of vaguely, but to symbolize, quote unquote, the continuation of the people of the United States of America to the cause of education in Ethiopia. And this is the inside of the library. The outside, certainly there's a bust of President Kennedy. It's actually a really amazing place to visit. And the Ethiopians, my colleagues who are professors there, were really excited to show to me, symbolically at least, my country, the United States' commitment to and presence in higher education on their campus. And to me, it was very striking, right? Coming back to this idea of diplomacy, the use of higher education for public goodwill, right? But today, as I think we all know, the idea of internationalization isn't really just about donating buildings to another country's universities. It's also through the exchanges of students and scholars and knowledge and innovation. So that brings us to the piece you read by Lomer and their point about soft power, which is the idea that countries can influence others through attraction and positive influence rather than coercion, right? So there's this political rationale that educating foreign elites who return home and then they occupy influential positions, that will be an advantage for the host country that educated them. This is definitely a well-established political rationale, but as Lomer's piece empirically demonstrated, and as other researchers have found, the evidence for this is pretty mixed and it's often anecdotal. So Lomer had a great piece about the UK. Today there's also a lot of discussion of the role that soft power plays in the exchanges between Chinese elites studying in the United States and then when they return home to their country. So there are a couple of different studies that have found, many wealthy and influential Chinese party official children study in the U.S. and then ascend to political positions back in China. They don't actually adopt pro-Western political values. And actually, in some cases, there's evidence that they become more nationalistic after returning home. And for the most part, researchers have found, just like Lomer did, that students often treat overseas education as more of a strategic career investment, right? So around human resources and skill development, rather than as an ideological or cultural transformative experience in terms of this idea of diplomacy and soft power. So I would note, though, that it's difficult to study this, and some of the reasons why the evidence is kind of limited is that obviously a lot of people who return to their home countries after elite education in other countries, oftentimes the global West or the global North and the West, these are politically sensitive figures, so it's tough to study people who are in those positions in general. And then also, this idea of soft power, how do you really measure it? It's a very long-term idea. So that's why I wouldn't say completely we can conclude that there really is no evidence that nations benefit from internationalization of higher education from a soft power or diplomacy standpoint, but there's definitely, you need to recognize, a tension here between this aspirational logic of what soft power could look like through internationalization of higher education and then the realities of global education mobility. So in addition to being a possible mechanism for realizing political goals, even though there's not great evidence of this, especially since the end of the Cold War and the emergence of the global knowledge economy, higher education internationalization has been leveraged as a key strategy for economic development, right? So to help national economies, to bring more money to individual institutions, to support human capital development of individuals. But on the flip side, potentially studying abroad could be bad. So maybe students from other countries experience unique challenges adapting to a new culture, or so more basically, maybe they just want to party. So for example, my sister runs a study abroad program in Italy, in Rome, for US students and who are juniors, and many of them are under the age of 21, and living in Italy and in Europe is the first time where they're able to buy alcohol and go to bars legally in that context. So potentially studying abroad could have some detrimental effects on students' academic performance. And also it could be true that some of the knowledge acquired when they study abroad isn't useful in their home country labor market. So we'll use the Erasmus Plus example from the EU Plus, which I'll get to in a second, to illustrate sort of what the evidence shows about this economic rationale. So Erasmus was mentioned in some of your readings about the Bologna process, but just to remind you, it was created in the late 1980s, with the intention of creating opportunities for partner institutions in Europe primarily to study or train or learn abroad. And so it's actually now called Erasmus Plus, and it includes not just institutions that are part of Bologna, but other institutions even outside of Europe. So for example, there are not a number of Russian universities that are part of the Erasmus Plus program. So there have been several studies that have looked at how this program has achieved economic benefits at the regional level, so for the EU and beyond, all of the partner countries, as well as at the national level for individual countries and individually. So before I talk about this specific study, which was actually recently published and is included in the supplemental materials on our Canvas page, I want to note that this study is a really good study because it uses very rigorous design. The European Commission, though, annually releases evaluations of Erasmus and related Bologna reforms, and descriptively at least, they've shown that there's improved labor market mobility and employment rates for graduates after graduation, and that graduates were more likely to work in international environments. However, the important thing about this study here is that it, again, as I mentioned, uses a really rigorous sort of what we call a quasi-experimental design, using data from students who applied for Erasmus Plus through the University of Calabria in Italy, and looking at the outcomes of everybody who applied, but those who actually participated in the program versus those who applied but didn't participate. Longitudinally, too, but their data set covered between 2004 to 2015. So even though it's just an individual institution in Italy, it's still, the design is really robust, and it uses longitudinal data. And what's interesting, so again, the idea is that this program, Erasmus Plus, now the objective is primarily economic. Although I'll note what's interesting is early on when it was established, the idea was to increase sociocultural exchange among European youth, that they would broaden their horizons, understand other European countries. And the idea was that, there would be a more unified Europe. But actually, this current version of Erasmus Plus, how it's evolved, it's basically really about economic sort of outcomes, again, at the individual, national, and regional level. So returning to the Benedetto study, I'm sure my sister could pronounce that better, but they found that, actually participating in Erasmus Plus, European students were at the individual level, individual benefits, definitely they were more likely to find a job quickly after graduation compared to non-participants by about 2.18 months. And then They also did some specific sub-analyses and found that male graduates were especially benefited career-wise compared to female graduates in terms of getting jobs. And then master's students, people who participated in master's programs and then graduated, had better chances of finding jobs and being successful in the labor market compared to Erasmus Plus bachelor's degrees participants. Similarly, STEM majors experienced better career-related outcomes compared to non-STEM majors in Erasmus Plus. But overall, too, so again, economically, at the individual level, students who completed the Erasmus Plus program on average had 22% average higher income than non-participants. However, they did also find that there was no effect on time to completion or grades. So it's not as though necessarily their performance was better, but from an economic, again, like labor market and career perspective, there's some good outcomes associated with this program. So one of the other things more at the national and regional level, right, as I mentioned, this idea of mobility is kind of about, brain drain and brain gain at the national and regional levels. And this study found that for these graduates, specifically in this data set, they were more likely to be working outside of Italy, but in a European country by 57%. So those who participated in Erasmus Plus were more likely to be employed outside of Italy and other European nations. So maybe it's a little bit of a brain drain for Italy, but it was beneficial for Europe because there was no effect on the participants' chances of working outside of Europe. So at least it didn't penalize participation in this program, hasn't penalized the European continent in terms of losing their Erasmus Plus graduates to other continents like the US, Asia, etc. So the European Commission, again, sort of talking about descriptive data, they've reported that Erasmus graduates were more likely to work in international environments, but they didn't use this kind of causal design and more nuanced perspective of comparing Europe to outside of Europe. So take that with a grain of salt. But in terms of overall, if we're thinking about, the economic rationale for internationalizing higher education and using regional partnerships and exchanges through national level agreements, those do benefit both the individual in terms of labor market mobility and outcomes. But I will say as well, too, that the graduates, again, have stayed within their region. So bringing back sort of human capital and economic value is staying within Europe as opposed to losing that value. So overall, Erasmus Plus is a good example, I would argue, with good evidence for how internationalization can benefit regions as well as generally individual economic outcomes. In terms of the national level, it's a little bit more complicated, but certainly from the individual and regional level, lots of good evidence supporting this. So you'll note that I didn't mention individual universities getting economic benefits from Erasmus Plus. I was just highlighting individual, national, and regional economic benefits of participation in Erasmus Plus. That's because that program is based on reciprocal exchanges. So students pay tuition always to their home institution, even if they're studying abroad in a host country. Typically, they're only studying abroad as part of Erasmus Plus for 1 or 2 semesters, but it's not seen as a revenue-generating mechanism that benefits individual universities, although they do receive funding for staff and supporting the program for host institutions, but it's really not, an institution level economically motivated internationalization strategy. However, there are other institutions that have innovative partnerships that are economically beneficial or are supposed to be economically beneficial. And one example is one from our institution, Arizona State, and our involvement in this company called Sintana Education, which is actually based at our Tempe campus. And so Sintana is a private company, and it's led by the founder of the for-profit chains, education chains, Laureate and Sylvan, a guy named Doug Becker. And it operates by forming long-term partnerships with international universities. So these partner universities pay to join the Sintana Alliance, which is, again, not a public company, a private company that is for-profit. And so universities in other countries pay to be part of this alliance, and in return, Sintana as a company gives them support over sort of management and university administration, higher education administration, as well as ASU is involved in this partnership. And ASU provides educational content to help the partner universities. So, course content, online courses, that type of thing. And ASU holds an equity stake in Sintana through its nonprofit that's affiliated with ASU Enterprise Partners. So that, in terms of, again, revenue sharing, should Sintana become profitable, ASU will get some of those revenues. I will say, so I'll talk about the evidence for that in a second. President Crow also kind of makes the argument that ASU's helping to prevent brain drain in other countries. From what I can tell, it's especially, the motivation is especially economic, but he's also, emphasized that, it's important for institutions in other countries to be high quality and help them develop local capacity and local expertise through delivering, high quality degree programs. So in terms of, to me, it's similar in a way, right, to the Bologna process, but instead of being, a continent-wide network of public universities, it's a network of international universities and ASU. I will note, though, that pretty much all of the Sintana partner universities are private, and many of them are also for-profit. There are two public universities, one definitely the National Institute of Technology in Pakistan, which is the only institution I think in Pakistan that is associated with ASU, and I think it might be public. ASU did also, or Sintana did also include a public university called Galala University in Egypt, which Egypt is really interesting. They're going through kind of a transformation of their higher education system, and they just established a new set of fourth generation public universities, and Galala is one of them. But this is 2025. I just checked the ASU Galala Sintana website, and it's down on both sides. So I don't know if Galala maybe bailed out of that partnership. But anyways, so again, it's similar as I said, to a network of universities similar to Bologna in its own way, although it's not driven by regional interests. It's really driven by institution level interests at ASU, and then also from a profit standpoint and economic rationale in terms of being able to generate revenues by selling content to universities in other countries. So in terms of the evidence for the economic benefits, there's nothing, and I've done a lot of research, trust me. I will actually give extra credit if anyone can find the financial statements of Sintana and executive compensation information, because that has not been published as far as I can tell. Again, it's a privately held company, so that is what it is, and it's run through Enterprise Partners, which is also, a affiliated nonprofit to the university. So the disclosure requirements of Enterprise Partners and Sintana are different from ASU directly. But from a practical standpoint, one thing that, again, this isn't directly an economic outcome of this internationalization strategy, but as I think I mentioned, I'm the co-PI on a project where we're collaborating ASU. Some researchers from ASU are collaborating with scholars at universities in Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Estonia. And when we first went to put together our consortium of university partners for this project, we immediately said, oh, hey, what universities are part of the Sintana network? And American University of Kyiv is one of the Sintana network universities. And actually the president is the former chair of or director of ASU Enterprise Partners, and he's actually brilliant guy. But we met with him, and we discovered that American University of Kyiv, because it's a private for-profit, we couldn't include them in our grant proposal because of their corporate structure. So we were only able to include nonprofit institutions in our consortium and our collaboration. So from a research and scholarly standpoint, in terms of getting grants, international grants, there can be some limitations to, this type of model, at least from my standpoint as an individual academic who's always looking to collaborate internationally. But, again, as I said, the primary motivation here from an institutional standpoint, ASU, this is the economic rationale for the institution level, not for me as an individual. And the idea is that when Sintana starts being profitable, ASU will be getting part of those profits because of the corporate structure, and we have an equity stake in that company. But again, no evidence that I've been able to find publicly as to whether or not this has actually been a successful internationalization strategy for the university from an economic standpoint. The Sintana Alliance is not the only type of institutional partnership that ASU has. There are more traditional partnerships that actually reflect what I would say are more common in kind of the field of institutional internationalization, and that's based on the sociocultural rationale. So partnerships can enhance reputations, enhance learning, and help both students and institutions develop and enhance their relationship or their reputations outside of their own context. And the example that I'm using here is the partnership that I helped to drive the establishment of a couple of years ago with Wallo University in Ethiopia. And really, truly, I know this is a messy slide, but it's resulted in a number of institutional as well as individual social and cultural benefits. So from an academic standpoint and professional standpoint, we've done already a number of studies together, applied for external funding, engaged in international or professional development workshops, teaching collaborations, et cetera. And actually, if you want and you're interested in seeing what a typical MOU, an agreement between two universities from different countries looks like that are establishing partnerships around internationalization, I've included the ASU Wallo MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, in the supplemental materials on Canvas. So you can check that out. So pretty much all of these non-business type partnerships, so Sintana is a totally different story, but traditional university partnerships usually involve establishing an MOU that kind of outlines non-binding types of collaborations such as these. And from, a sociocultural, again, rational standpoint, so this is, again, anecdotal because I haven't yet published any research about this, but one of the things that, I have seen or at least witnessed, and I need to collect some better data around this in terms of how this partnership has benefited both ASU and Wallo, is we established, kind of to kick off the partnership, we supported this amazing event a couple of years ago in Addis Ababa, which brought Wallo University, which is located in one region in Ethiopia, with two other universities, Mekelle and Samara universities, located in two other regions. All of these regions at the time had just been part of a civil war. So there was fighting going on in each of the regions, and actually many people who work at and are students of these various universities were actually fighting against one another, literally part of the different armies. So it's pretty amazing. But ASU joined Wallo in partnership with these other two universities to organize a symposium a couple of years ago about how universities can contribute to post-conflict transformation, specifically in Ethiopia. And so ASU, here's our little part of our little delegation here. We brought a bunch of faculty from all across the university to participate in this symposium around all of these different sort of themes where we see, universities contributing to communities and benefiting communities and peace and stability at the center. But that's all predicated upon, other things that universities can contribute to their communities and to their societies. So it was a pretty amazing event. It was covered too by, the Minister of Education in Ethiopia was there. There were a lot of kind of big names from the government there, and it gave ASU a lot of great publicity in Ethiopia. It's pretty amazing. Traveling to Ethiopia now, ASU is a very well-known institution from the work that we've been doing around this project, as well as some funded by MasterCard and the former ones funded by USAID. So it's certainly enhanced ASU's reputation. I need to do a better job of documenting that, in addition to producing more academic outputs that benefit the university's reputation ultimately, because university rankings, right, are based on co-published articles. And also, I'll note, these scholarly outputs are also metrics that are used, you might recall from Module 1, how to operationalize this idea of internationalization. Co-publishing articles with Global South authors is actually one of the common metrics that's used to kind of rank universities on internationalization dimensions. And as we know, as I've already mentioned, ASU really likes to talk about rankings and put them on the sides of buses. And so this work is really producing benefit to ASU as well as to Wallow, because Wallow is a second-generation university, or third-generation actually, in Ethiopia. So it's a newer university. It was established, I think, in 2005. I can't be certain. One of the tricky things, actually, Ethiopia, you see this is 2016. Ethiopia's calendar is a couple of years behind the U.S. because they have 13 months. They go off a different calendar, so I always get confused as to what years things happened in my work there because of their different calendar. But anyways, so they are a newer university than ASU. And so, in countries like Ethiopia, usually disproportionately international attention goes to the quote unquote flagship universities, right? The oldest universities, like in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa University, Bahir Dar University, Hawassa University. Those are kind of, where a lot of international attention goes. So the fact that we at ASU have partnered with Wallow is something that's really kind of enhanced their status in the public system in Ethiopia. Here's a picture actually of President Mengesha. He was the president of Wallow a couple years ago. He's now at Bahir Dar. He's moved on up in the world. Although, whatever, I'm not going to get into that. I miss him being at Wallow, as well as President Crow. Mengesha visited a couple of years ago to discuss this partnership, and it was a pretty fun visit, as was our symposium, even though the topic was pretty serious. But this is all to illustrate an example of how, at the institution level, partnerships can be beneficial from a sociocultural standpoint, especially for institutional reputation in both contexts. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this presentation by going on a tiny bit of a tangent, but not really, by discussing a little bit more higher education's contributions to society from a comparative standpoint. So technically, right, like this conversation and the focus of this module has been about the benefits of internationalization to society, which one of my examples is about that. But I also want to highlight the fact that not just in the U.S. do countries see higher education as serving a valuable societal role. One dimension, especially, is around preserving indigenous knowledge and culture. And a really great example is this national program in Guatemala, which integrates indigenous Mayan languages and cultures into their entire national education system. So this program, which I'm not going to even try to pronounce because my Spanish is terrible, but the goal is the program has designed curricula that includes both bilingual education in Spanish as well as various indigenous languages, and then also emphasizes different ideas and content from the cultural heritage of the Mayan people in Guatemala. And so the idea, right, is that it's promoting intercultural understanding and respect among various communities in Guatemala, which I think is really cool. And there's a lot of evidence that this really truly has institutionalized bilingual education and preserved culture. And I think there are a lot of countries that grapple with sort of tensions between indigenous communities that could learn from this model. For example, coming from more of a specific and personal level example, is Wallow University. So as I've mentioned, Wallow is located, and their campus was actually heavily damaged as part of the Civil War that happened a few years ago. And so here's an example from my visit to Wallow's campus of their community pharmacy. So they're located in this town called Desi, and they have a very robust center of excellence around healthcare and pharmaceutical sort of support for people, medicines, and they run a community pharmacy in Desi to provide low-cost treatments for community members. So that's one direct example of outreach in terms of an institution. But then in addition, during the war, their health faculty created a traveling clinic, and they would travel around to different villages to treat those injured by war. And again, anecdotal, I hope that they will publish some pieces about this soon, but the response from community members who I met when I've gone to visit Desi has been such extreme gratitude and appreciation for the presence of Wallow in the Desi community, and recognition for the value that they brought to the people, especially in times of serious crisis, where their expertise was really valued. More from, here we go. Here's my internationalization example, actually. So this is an institute in Iran. So the Bahia Institute for Higher Education. So Bahia students are a minority in Iran, and so a marginalized community. And so this institute was established to provide higher education to Bahia students because they're not allowed admission to Iranian universities. So this network actually operates through volunteer faculty and international partnerships, and they've given students, many students from this background, the chance to study abroad who would otherwise not be able to access higher education in Iran. So I think this is a beautiful example of how internationalization in particular contexts can really serve society, especially marginalized communities. But of course, there is this final caveat, and this is a quote, I think, from Lomer, the Lomer article you read. When a university becomes over-identified with the political interests of the state, it has probably lost its way. And this is a topic we'll revisit in our discussion of accountability and quality using the case of higher education in Nazi Germany. But there is, at the institution level, this tricky balance between national interests and how and what that looks like in terms of internationalization and higher education service to society versus institutional interests and what's best for students, faculty, and other stakeholders of those institutions. Okay, so wrapping up this presentation, I had like 8 more slides I could have talked about, but I know I'm going over time. But wrapping this up, so these are the motivations here. There are political, sociocultural, and economic motivations for why higher education internationalization can benefit different levels of constituents, right? My takeaway, and I think I've driven this home already, think about always, what's the evidence? These are great motivations, but what's the evidence that internationalization actually has this type of impact? And also, is it good or bad for a country, economically, socially, culturally, politically, for its higher education system to become more internationalized? And similarly, is it good or bad for individual universities as well as individual students, faculty, administrators, and stakeholders? So we're going to build upon this discussion, particularly at the individual level and also the institutional level, as we go forward in this course with lots of different comparative examples as we kind of move forward. But these are important considerations to keep in mind for the rest of the course, introducing, these different rationales for internationalization, and also thinking about, again, are we actually achieving, or does this work actually achieve what it proposes to do?